Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Matthew Darius. I'm the Professional Development Coordinator here at New York ASBO. And I'll be moderating today's call. We have Human Resource Pitfalls today with Patrick Fitzgerald from Girvin and Ferlazzo. If you have a question for him at any time during the webinar, please feel free to use the question and answer pane on your GoToWebinar control panel. That control panel is typically on your right-hand side of the screen. If it's minimized, you'll see a red arrow on your screen. Click that. Everything will come back out. Type your question right in there, and we'll get it answered for you. If you haven't received the handout yet, there's a handout section on your GoToWebinar control panel. You can click that, and it'll download the PDF to your computer. With that out of the way, I'm going to turn it over. Patrick, it's all yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Pat Fitzgerald from Girvin and Ferlazzo. I have to tell you, this is incredibly foreign to me. This is the first time that I've ever been a presenter on a GoToWebinar. And quite frankly, I don't necessarily like it because I love the interaction that I have with people when I'm in a room. And if anyone has ever seen me present before, which you likely have not, I also tend to pace around the room incessantly and be all over the place. So I have to use all of my willpower to stay seated in my chair at my desk here. Thank you, Matthew, for the introduction. I really, even though this is a little bit of a stilted format because we are doing it by way of webinar, I really want to have interaction from people to the extent we can. So if people would email their questions early and often to Matt, Matt will jump in and interrupt me, and I'll answer the questions. And I often find that that's a good way to direct the flow of conversation rather than folks just listening to me for an hour. Okay. This is pretty much the same things that I spoke about at the conference earlier this year. I'm slated to appear again, I believe, at the conference next year. So I had a good time meeting with everybody several months ago, or whenever it was, and look forward to that opportunity in the future. And one more bit of background. By way of our firm, we're in Albany, New York. We represent 70-plus school districts throughout New York State. So we're well used to appearing in front of folks like you. We may even represent some of the districts where you work. And I do a lot of litigation work, but I also have a particular focus on labor and employment law. So we're going to talk about employment pitfalls today. We're really going to spend most of our time talking about the ADA and the Fmla. We only have an hour, and that's a pretty big topic. So I'm going to start scrolling through my presentation. And we're going to get to the pitfalls pretty quickly. But as I said, ask any questions that you have, and we'll get those answered. Let's see here. There we go. The ADA, the Fmla, the Fair Labor Standards Act, anti-discrimination laws, how are they enforced? They're enforced by private lawsuits. Investigations by the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that's the EEOC. So all of your discrimination laws, race, gender, age, so on and so forth, are subject to investigations by the EEOC. Proceedings before the New York State Division of Human Rights. The New York State Division of Human Rights is the state counterpart to the federal EEOC. So anybody in New York State who has an employment claim of harassment or discrimination under any of the human rights laws can bring a complaint in front of the New York State Division of Human Rights. Many of the laws that, and both the EEOC and the Division of Human Rights would cover claims under, at the federal level, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, or at the state level, the human rights law, which has corresponding provisions to the ADA. Your laws like the Fmla, the Fair Labor Standards Act, those can be proceedings before both the United States Department of Labor, but much more frequently the New York State Department of Labor, who's very aggressive with respect to those issues. So let's turn quickly to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. and the New York human rights law. Pretty much identical in terms of the scope of their coverage, except that under the New York human rights law, the standard for what is a disability is much lower than under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I often say that under the New York State human rights law, a hangnail can be considered to be a disability, while there's a more stringent test under the ADA. For the purpose of folks in New York, you pretty much have to take a very expansive view of what is a disability in order to be in compliance with the laws in New York. So under the federal laws, who is disabled? Somebody who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of life's major activities. They have a history or a record of impairment, or they're regarded as having an impairment. Let me give you a little scenario with respect to that last bullet point, being regarded as having such an impairment. I had a phone call today with one of our clients who has an employee who has a particular disability, who really doesn't, that disability really does not affect that employee's ability to do her job in this case. But coworkers regard her as more disabled than she is. So when she forgets something, coworkers jump to the conclusion, oh, it's as a result of this disability. We often see that in the mental health context, where you may have an employee who suffers from a mental illness. The quirky behavior that Patrick might exhibit on a daily basis, and Patrick doesn't have a mental health diagnosis, you'd say, you know, Patrick is quirky, or, you know, there he goes again. But all of a sudden, the person who has a mental health issue, it becomes a matter of grave concern for you, and you start treating that person differently because you regard them as impaired when they might not be impaired. And that's something that you have to be very careful about when you have people who have disabilities, that all of a sudden you're not judging their performance standard by a different standard than you would other employees based on an assumption that you might have about their disability or how it might affect their behavior. And that's how the being regarded as having an impairment comes into play with respect to disability discrimination issues. Drugs in the ADA, and it's a common topic that we deal with our clients. Former drug users who are not currently engaged in the illegal use of drugs are protected under the ADA. So if I have an employee who was a drug user and is no longer a drug user and has gone through a treatment program, I can't hold that former drug abuse against them, or the fact that they were a drug user. Drug use, if a person is in a supervised rehabilitation program or has completed rehabilitation and is not currently using drugs, that same rule applies, okay? Alcoholism is another example. Alcoholism is potentially a disability protected under the ADA. Having said that, that does not give people who are alcoholics a free pass to behave however they want or to show up at work intoxicated. So there's nothing that prevents an employer from requiring sobriety in the workplace, for prohibiting employees from coming in to work under the influence of alcohol or smelling of alcohol, or excluding them from activities or programs if their behavior is disruptive. Rather, the fact that you may or may not have an alcoholic employee might affect what type of accommodation you need to give to them. And that's a good segue to kind of the next thing that we'll talk about with respect to the ADA. So what does the ADA require? It requires for somebody who has a disability for the employer to offer a reasonable accommodation to that person to allow that person to perform the essential functions of his or her position. So what does that mean? There's a couple of loaded terms in there. It requires a reasonable accommodation. Reasonable is a loaded term. Accommodation is a loaded term. And to perform the essential functions of his or her position. A disability is not an excuse for an employee to do a poor job at work. It's not a pass for that employee to not meet their expectations at work. Rather, a disability gives the employer right to seek and to obtain a reasonable accommodation that will allow the employee to essentially do their job in accordance with the standards that are set for all employees in the school district or organization or what have you. And that's a very important thing to remember. An accommodation is designed to allow somebody to perform the essential functions of their job. It's not to lower the standards. It's not to give them a pass. It's not to make life easy for them. It's to, what can we do so that you can do what you need to do in your workplace at the performance levels that we expect of you and every other employee in the district. And what's reasonable or not depends on the factual scenario of what they're requesting and what impact that might have on an employer. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So you have an obligation to grant a reasonable accommodation to allow somebody to perform the essential functions of his or her job. Common mistakes with the ADA. The first mistake is mistakes that people make at interviews. And in the handouts, I believe that I may have, I haven't looked at them in a while. I don't know whether or not I provided, let's see here. Actually, I did not. I have a handout that I sometimes provide to people of do's and don'ts interview questions under the ADA. You can actually find them online. The United States Department of Labor has a good website on it. But basically what you can't do during an interview when you're seeking to hire somebody is ask them questions that are going to cause them to reveal the fact that they have a disability, a prior illness, a workers' compensation claim, prior work absences due to an illness or disability, what types of medications they're on, questions about the need for whether they need an accommodation to perform the essential functions of their job, essentially questions that would cause the interviewee to have to reveal that the interviewee has some type of disability or would need some type of accommodation to do the job are prohibited during the interview process, and asking those questions would run afoul of the ADA. The notion there is that one's disability or one's need for an accommodation should not factor into the hiring process whatsoever. Once somebody is hired, they may need and may request an accommodation, and then under the law, it's the employer's obligation to provide them with a reasonable accommodation if they do in fact have a disability. But any question that might cause an employee to, or a prospective employee to reveal that they have a disability is prohibited during the interview process, whether it's in the form of a questionnaire or doing the interview itself. The real only exception to that rule is if a person comes into an interview and it's so obvious that they have a disability, that it's physically manifested, obviously in a way that they might need an accommodation in order to perform the job. In those very rare circumstances, it's appropriate to ask an employee a question such as, how do they anticipate getting their job done? Is there any accommodation that they could foresee? You have an interviewee for a PE position who comes in with blind. You know, you don't, obviously it's not a secret that the person has a disability and may need an accommodation. But it's those very rare circumstances where questions about a disability or an accommodation are allowed during the hiring process. Other common mistakes under the ADA. If you recall, I said that the purpose of an accommodation is to allow a person to perform the essential functions of his or her position. So what does it mean by essential functions of his or her position? Not every item that might be listed on a job duty list or a job description are necessarily an essential function. An essential function is exactly what it sounds like. What is the crux of the position? What are the core things that a person absolutely needs to do? So an employee may have, as part of their job, essential functions for the employee for the job and non-essential functions. Again, there is no bright line test for that, but people make the mistake all the time of having a job description and thinking that every bullet point on that list is an essential function, and that if an employee cannot perform every single job bullet on that list, that somehow they're disqualified from the job, and that if that job point couldn't be accommodated, then you have a right to let that employee go. You really have to focus on what are essential functions. At the same time, I can tell you that the Department of Labor or the Human Rights, Division of Human Rights, or the EEOC, if you have job descriptions for employees and that spell out the job functions, you're going to have a very hard time suggesting to someone that something that is not listed there is an essential function of the job. So if there's a job description, for instance, it doesn't have a lifting requirement, that the employee has to lift a certain amount of weight, a certain frequency in their job description, and you have this job description for the employee, you're going to be very hard-pressed arguing to an agency or to a court later on that that's an essential function of the position if it's not listed in the job description. So the job description catches you both coming and going. You're bound by what's in there, but at the same time, don't think that everything that's in there is necessarily an essential function of the position. So remember, we said that the purpose of an accommodation is to allow somebody to perform the essential functions of their position. So how do you determine whether or not a person is entitled to an accommodation? Okay. First, it's the employee's responsibility to come forward seeking an accommodation. Let's say that I have an employee who is poorly performing and not doing their job, and I think that that person might have a health issue going on that's affecting the employee, and I want to give the employee a negative review. What I do not say to the employee is, hey, you've done a poor job, but I think it's because of some disability you have, so let's talk about that. Rather, what you do is you say, you've done a poor job. You're not meeting the expectations of the position. It is then up to the employee to say, well, the reason why I haven't been meeting the expectation of the positions is because I have some type of disability and I need help accommodating that disability. It's the employee's responsibility to come forward with that request for an accommodation. They don't have to use the magical language accommodation. They don't have to use that term, but they need to come forward and indicate in some way that they need help due to some type of condition that they have. That doesn't give them a pass for the prior times when they performed poorly and had never asked for an accommodation, but it affects your rights going forward. And the lesson for that is you should not, as an employer, be the one raising a disability issue with the employee. It's not your job to talk about the employee's disability. You should never talk about the employee's disability. It's up to the employee to come forward and to say, hey, I need this accommodation, okay? So once we get to that point where an employee does say that I need an accommodation, what happens next? What happens is you have to engage in what's called the interactive process with an employee. And that's a term that the EEOC loves to use and loves to catch employers on. The interactive process is a process by which you sit down with the employee. The employee has now said to you, hey, I need an accommodation. Basically, the interactive process is, let's talk about it. What type of accommodation do you think you need and why? And then the employer responds to that. So on and so forth. But there is some dialogue between the employee and the employer where you're discussing the disability and whether there's an accommodation that might be met, and brainstorming, so to speak, about whether or not an accommodation can be met. That is the interactive process. If you fail to engage in the interactive process with an employee, you are violating the ADA for not having done so. So even if you know right off the bat, there is no way that we're going to ever be able to accommodate this employee, you still have to engage, and you should engage in the interactive process with the employee to come to that determination through the interactive process, rather than just saying, I'm not going to bother because I know it's a waste of time to do that. Very important to engage in it, very important to document that you have engaged in the interactive process. So what types of problems do we have when with respect to granting accommodations? Now we've engaged in the interactive process. We've brainstormed about accommodations. A common mistake that we have is failing to grant reasonable accommodations. I have a bullet point on the screen of prior performance woes. This is a common situation. I have an employee who is a terrible employee. They've done a really bad job of doing their work. I may or may not have counseled them or disciplined about that in the past. More often than not, unfortunately, we see that I haven't, an employer hasn't counseled or disciplined them, but I know that I haven't fired them. But they think that, you know, gee, I'm going to get fired unless I do something, so they come to you and say, hey, I have this disability, I need an accommodation. I'm an alcoholic, and I need to take a half an hour extra time at lunchtime to attend an AA meeting, okay? So I need a slight adjustment of my shift as an accommodation to allow me to get treatment for my alcoholism. You say, oh my gosh, you know, this is just another in a long line of excuses. This person is a terrible employee. It's a subterfuge to get them out of having to be responsible for their actions. I don't want to grant an accommodation because this is just, you know, only going to prolong the amount of time that I have this terrible employee working for us. That's exactly the last thing that you should do. When an employee comes to you with a request for an accommodation, you need to start from scratch there and say, okay, I need to deal with this accommodation request, okay?
I've got a question for you.
Yep.
This is from Cynthia. She wants to know, what about a bus driver who has to pass physical tests to be able to drive? There are really no accommodations that can be done. Are they protected, or is it a different case?
No, and that's, so let's say that I have a bus driver who has certain requirements, certification requirements, in order to drive the bus, certain fitness tests to drive the bus that are common to all bus drivers. And I have a bus driver, you know, really two categories. One, somebody who just can't do it but doesn't necessarily have a disability. That's an easy question. That's not an ADA question. But somebody who has a disability that prevents them from passing the test. So the question then becomes, is passing this test essential? Is it a necessary prerequisite for this job, or is there some way that the person could do this job without passing the test? And if the answer is yes, it's an absolute requirement for the job, can't perform the test or can't perform the job without passing the test, you say to the person, well, as a bus driver, I need you to pass the test. I can't have you drive unless we pass the test. So I can't, there's not an accommodation that I could make of just ignoring that requirement. So that's not a possible accommodation. And this is the interactive process. So you say to the employee, what is it that might help you to pass the test? Well, the person says, you know, if I have 3 weeks off and they're able to recuperate, then I think that I would be able to pass the test. Then the employer has a decision. I either give the employee 3 weeks off, unpaid leave, or I fire them on the spot. Well, the law would say, gee, giving the employee 3 weeks off to pass the test sounds like a reasonable accommodation for this person's disability. And that's one of the types of accommodations that exists out there. Under the third bullet point is some leave time, okay? Is the person not able to pass the test because of some physical limitation that if there was an equipment modification that's reasonable, the employee could pass the test? Yes, you know, there might be, and there might be a simple fix to a physical limitation that would allow the employee to properly pass the test. That's the nature of an accommodation as well. But you can see the employee has failed the test. So you say to the employee, listen, you've failed the test, you can't be a bus driver. The employee says, well, it's a result of my disability. Okay, now the employee has introduced the ADA issue. You have that interactive process with them. Can't waive the test. Is there some type of physical modification of the bus that would allow you to pass the test? No, none that I'm aware of. Okay, that's not an option. Is there some period of time that you might need off on a leave, on an unpaid leave basis that would allow you to recuperate and retake the test and pass the test? No, this is pretty much me for life. Hey, I can't think of anything else. Is there anything else that you can think of that would allow you to pass the test? No, I can't think of anything else. Well, you know what? Then I guess we've gone through this interactive process. We can't think of any accommodation. It's time for your employment to end because you're not able to perform the essential functions of your position with or without a reasonable accommodation. There is no reasonable accommodation that can be afforded here. Okay? So that's how that scenario would go, and it kind of encapsulates a lot of what we talked about: the employee coming forward first, making the request for an accommodation, the interactive process, and a range of different types of accommodations and ways that you might approach a situation, but at the end of the day requiring the employee to perform the essential functions, which is here passing a fitness test. Okay? So going back to the prior performance woes, you know, as much as you hate to, you have to put them out of your mind when you're talking about accommodating somebody's or complying with somebody's request for an accommodation when they've now come forward with a disability. But having said that, they've been a poor employee in the past. You now give them an accommodation. They're continuing to be a poor employee. And again, like I said before, their disability doesn't give them a pass on doing a bad job. It just sets forth a basis or an obligation to maybe provide some accommodation to them that would allow them to do the job at the level that you expected. The next bullet point I have is impacts on other employees. I think the prime example that I see of this is the employee who comes forward and says, hey, I have asthma, it's springtime, I need a window air conditioner in my classroom. You say, oh my God, if I give this employee a window air conditioner, every teacher in the wing is going to come and ask me for a window air conditioner. So the rule of thumb there is it doesn't matter that everybody else is going to ask for a window air conditioner. If everybody else is in fact disabled and in fact would be entitled to a reasonable accommodation, and in fact a window air conditioner is a reasonable accommodation for their condition, the fact that it might create a cascading effect is irrelevant because you have the obligation to treat each individual employee separately and determine whether or not that employee is entitled to a reasonable accommodation and what is reasonable in those circumstances. So that's always a tricky situation where you have this cascading effect, and it does often require thinking through that and how things are going to play out, but you have to think through it with the mindset of also complying with the ADA at all times. Leave time, accessibility, equipment, modified work shift schedules, etc. We touched on that briefly. Excuse me while my phone rings here. We're just going to let that go into my voicemail. Hold on one second. Okay, so leave time, accessibility, equipment, modified work shift schedules. I talked about leave time. Leave time is kind of funny because I said an accommodation is intended to allow an employee to perform the essential functions of his or her position. How is a leave from work, not working, allowing somebody to perform the essential functions of their position? Doesn't seem on its face like it would make sense, but basically what the courts and what the agencies say is that if you're talking about a defined period of time, not a leave forever for an undefined period of time, but some defined period of time that would allow somebody to recuperate or recover from a disability and then get back to work, that grant of a leave time could be a form of an accommodation. And is one that we commonly see. It's probably the most frequent type of accommodation that's granted. So you have a situation where an employee seeks a leave for 3 weeks, and then at the end of that 3 weeks they seek another leave for 3 weeks, and at the end of that 3 weeks they seek another leave for 3 weeks, so on and so forth. All of a sudden my 3-week leave, which seemed reasonable, is now 6 months and is not reasonable. There's a strategy for dealing with that. It's important to get counsel, or if you're particularly experienced in ADA issues, to deal with that strategy. But you really need to lay the groundwork up front with the employee if a situation like that is going to be a problem. Granting the leave, but explaining up front how much of a hardship it grants to, how much of a hardship to the district it is to grant the leave, and papering that so that on successive requests you can say, we have faced undue hardship in the past, and now we're at the breaking point. So unless you come back at the end of this next leave, we're going to have to terminate your employment and start the process to do that. So that's part of that process, and it really requires some diligence up front and a game plan, which we institute for our clients in those circumstances. The next bullet point, overestimating undue financial hardships. When we talk about a reasonable accommodation, pretty much what's reasonable is something that does not impose an undue hardship on the employer. And again, what's an undue hardship? Hard to define. If it's going to jeopardize students' success, that's a pretty good undue hardship. If it's going to really cause the district to incur significantly increased costs or not get the job done in other areas, those are types of undue hardships. One problem that we have with school districts is that the test for a financial hardship is a hard test for a school district to meet, because sometimes the courts say, well, you're a taxing authority, you can just raise the taxes, without any conception of the way that school budgets currently are these days. But you have to be careful about having a knee-jerk reaction of $200 is a lot of money or $500 is a lot of money, we can't afford it. That's a financial hardship, because in light of the total budget of a school district, that's pretty minuscule. Okay. The other area that I'd like to talk about here is you have an employee who's doing a poor job. Wait a second. Before I get there, let me talk about this. Modified work shift schedules. One of the things that I often hear from our clients is that they'll say, we don't grant light duty. We don't allow light duty work. So therefore, don't even ask for light duty work. We don't allow it. Or you can only return to your work when you're able to perform your job without limitation. Those are two huge errors that you could ever make. You might come to the same conclusion using different language, but let's go back to we don't do light duty. Well, the fact of the matter is that a light duty type of a modification could be the form of a reasonable accommodation. So you should never say right off the bat, we don't do light duty. Because right off the bat, you're saying, under no circumstance will we give an accommodation to somebody of a light duty accommodation. You've just bypassed the interactive process and reached that conclusion totally. So if somebody has a light duty type of situation, you need to consider that as a possible accommodation and whether or not it can be granted. It might not be granted in all or almost all of the time, but you still need to go through the process and think about it as an accommodation. You know, a good example is, hey, I'm going to come back in a month, but this week I can only come back 50% of the time, next week 60, the following week 80% of the time, the fourth week full time. That's a light duty accommodation. It's a work hardening type of thing. A court or the EEOC would say, I don't know how that's so unreasonable. So you have to be careful about blanket statements such as, we don't do light duty, or we don't accommodate shift schedules, or something along those lines, okay? Going back to my other example, I see this all the time. I have an employee who is doing poorly at work, and I suspect it might be because they have alcoholism, or they have a mental health issue, or some other type of issue going on there. And I have clients all the time who want to jump to a Section 913 medical exam under the Education Law, or a Section 72 exam under the Civil Service Law, and want to get to the root and find out that this person is not capable of performing their job function. And I think that that's a huge mistake. And I've had arguments with folks in my office who kind of have a knee-jerk reaction towards doing those things. And the reason why I think that that's a mistake is because I always say you respond to the person's work behavior, you don't respond to their disability. So if somebody is doing a poor job at work, all that matters for you is that they're doing a poor job at work, and you need to respond to the fact that they're doing a poor job. You don't need to find out that they're doing a poor job because they have some type of disability. That's not your responsibility. You just simply say to them, you're not meeting expectations. If they come forward and say, well, it's because I have a disability, then you can request medical documentation from them with respect to that disability, or, excuse me, with respect to the type of accommodation they need for that disability. But I think it's a mistake for you as the employer to be inserting that into the equation first by doing a 913 exam or a Section 72 exam. In fact, I find that the most useful purposes of those types of exams are when I have somebody who says, you know, I'm not disabled and I am able to do the work, and you have a concern about their safety in terms of coming back, then you might use it that way, where the person has already established a disability but saying they're not disabled. You may, in certain circumstances, use it there. But be careful of the knee-jerk reaction of wanting to send somebody for a fitness for duty type of exam to establish that they're disabled in some regard, because all you're going to do is establish that now they're protected under the ADA, and we have to talk about accommodations when the employee has never requested that or come forward with any information in that regard. Anybody have questions about the ADA? We're going to turn to the FMLA, but anybody have any questions about what I've said so far?
Yep, there's a question here. Is there such a thing as light duty for staff whose work is physical, such as a cleaner, custodian, or maintenance worker?
And it depends. It depends on the process. Let's say that I have an employee who can't lift boxes more than 50 pounds, okay? And that's something that they might have to do 1% of the time at work. Then I get to a question is it an essential function of the job? Or even if it is an essential function of the job, what's my other staffing arrangement? Is there a way that I could, on a temporary basis, accommodate that person with respect to a lifting restriction? Is it really going to interfere with the ability to get work done? Can I mobilize my troops in such a way to accommodate that request for that particular person? Conversely, if it's the summertime and my maintenance staff is in charge of cleaning a building and stripping the floors and whatnot, which is constant heavy-duty work, and I have one maintenance staff assigned to each building or a wing of a building, and I had that same person come forward with that restriction, I would say, gee, I don't know how you're ever going to, you're only able to do a third of your job with that lifting restriction, and I don't know how I can accommodate that. You have all of the equipment available to you to assist you, but still you would have to do that stuff on a regular basis. I can't think of a way that I could accommodate that and you would still get the work done that we need for you to do. I don't have a way of reshuffling folks or assigning tasks or whatnot, and it would require a global restructuring of the whole department, which would become an undue burden. Making other employees substantially change their work requirements to accommodate one employee is often viewed as not something that an employer has to do. So it really depends on the scope of the disability and an examination of what the person's job duties are, and you just have to go through that interactive process based on those factors with the employee. Other questions out there?
Yes. Regarding undue financial hardship, what about having to redo all mats in the gym and reordering all cleaning supplies due to a latex allergy?
It becomes a question of, it is a question of cost. And the cost analyses are the hardest ones to deal with for a school district. They're much easier for a small private employer than they are for a school district. But phasing out cleaning supplies, using a certain type of cleaning supplies in a school maybe where this employee is while you phase in other types of cleaning supplies, there's lots of ways that you might be able to skin the cat in terms of accommodating that request and not cause it to be financial hardship. There comes a breaking point, though, from a dollars and cents standpoint, and it really depends on looking closely at what would be required to be done and what really are those actual costs of doing it. And it really comes down to a case-by-case basis.
All right, I have a question on the FMLA if you want to take it.
Okay.
Qualifying reason for leave, caring for spouse or immediate family member with a serious health issue.
Yeah.
I assume that is it a qualifying reason for leave?
It is. So I just split the screen to the Family and Medical Leave Act, so let's segue there. Two things. In order for somebody to be qualified for leave under the Family Medical Leave Act, they have to have been in your employment for 12 months. When there's gaps of employment, they get to string together the prior employment sometimes, but the general rule is 12-month period of employment. And they have to work 1,250 hours in the 12-month period prior to the time that they've requesting the leave under the Family Medical Leave Act. Your teachers are automatically considered to have met that 1,250-hour requirement. So don't count the hours of a teacher. If you have a teacher who maybe has been out for 8 months of the year, then you can look at it. But a full-time regular teacher is considered to have met the 1,250 hours in the 12-month period. People often ask, are part-time employees eligible for leave under the FMLA? Depends on whether their part-time hours accumulated to 1,250 hours in the 12-month period prior to the leave. What are qualifying reasons for leave? Birth, adoption, or foster placement. Serious health condition, and that can be both the serious health condition of the employee or the serious health condition of the employee's relative. So that answers the question that was posed regarding a child or a spouse's serious health condition. If the employee needs to care for that family member, that's a qualifying reason for FMLA leave. And then there's a whole realm of qualifying reasons for leave with respect to exigencies for military members. And also there's another statute called USERRA, which is a federal statute protecting rights for people in the armed services that dovetails pretty similarly with the FMLA in many respects. Okay? Common FMLA mistakes. Failing to define the 12-month period. Okay, I said that, let me go back here. An employee gets 12 weeks of FMLA, assuming that they're qualified, assuming they have their 12 months of employment, work 1,250 hours, and have a qualifying leave. An employee is entitled to 12 weeks of unpaid leave under the Family Medical Leave Act during a 1-year period, okay? And that 12 weeks can be taken in a lump sum, or it can be taken intermittently over time, which we'll talk about. And I do have a handout that was provided on the FMLA leave, which talks about intermittent leave pretty extensively. So I say that you're entitled to take 12 weeks of leave in a 12-month period. This is really for the policymakers of districts that are out there listening, but there's 4 ways that you can define that 12-month period. You can define it by a calendar year, January 1 to December 31. You can define it by another construct of a year. A lot of school districts are inclined to say July 1 to June 30, or following a school year calendar. You can do what's called the 12-month looking backward, or you can do the 12-month looking forward. I'm going to skip the 12-month looking forward because, quite frankly, in all of my years of doing this, which are considerable, I still don't think I understand the 12-month looking forward period. So cross that off the list as one to even consider. This is the problem with the first two, the calendar year or the school year. And I'll just use calendar year by way of example. I said you can do 12 weeks in the 1-year period. I'm defining my 1-year period as the calendar year. If you do a calendar year, somebody could take 12 weeks of FMLA as the last 12 weeks of, for instance, calendar year 2015, and then 12 weeks as the first 12 weeks of calendar year 2016. So when you do it that way, whether calendar year or school year, you're essentially allowing somebody to take up to 24 consecutive weeks of leave under the FMLA, because your 1-year measurement period, they're complying with that measurement period. I have a 2015 1-year measurement period, I've taken 12 weeks. And I have a 2016 measurement period, again, I've taken my 12 weeks, strung them back to basically have 24 weeks. The method that I like, and I think is, quite frankly, the easiest to use, is the 12-month looking backward, or 12-month retroactive. That means that at any given time, today is October 13th, Patrick has 12 weeks of leave from right now. If I have taken 12 weeks of leave in the past year as of October 13th, I'm not entitled to any. If I haven't taken 12 weeks of leave in the past year, from October 13th of this year, looking back to October 14th of last year, I could take today as FMLA leave if I met all of the other requirements.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, it's very easy to look back and figure out, does this person have any leave time available to them? Yes.
Cindy wants to know if it's okay to do a 12-month a rolling 12-month period.
And when you say a rolling 12-month period, what I'm really talking about is a rolling 12-month period, because I'm looking. And the confusion is that sometimes you see this rolling 12-month period as a 12-month look-forward period, which, again, I don't even want to go there. It's way too complicated. But I think of the 12-month looking back as a 12-month rolling period. On any given day, I'm just taking out the calendar and looking at whether or not this person has taken 12 weeks of FMLA leave in the past year or not. And that's a moving target. Every day, you know, is a new day. So let's say Patrick took 12 weeks last year ending on October 20th, okay? Or excuse me. Let me not look at it that way. Let's say Patrick took 12 weeks ending on consecutively from January 1 until whatever 12 weeks later is, say March 30, okay? Now it's January 1 of the next year. I look back, no, Patrick has taken 12 weeks. It's not going to be till April. It's not going to be till April 1 that a day is freeing up. Excuse me, strike that. On January 2, a day is freeing up for me because January 1 of the previous year fell off, so on and so forth. So I just take my calendar, I look back, say I have an F on my calendar where somebody took FMLA leave. I count those Fs in the 12-month preceding period. Whether or not they've taken 12 weeks, they don't have any. If they haven't taken 12 weeks, they have that time available to them on that day. And every day is a new day looking forward. Does that make sense? It's a little hard to explain over the computer. If anybody has a question about that, let me know. Okay? So if your district does it differently and you change the 12-month period, it's really easy to do. There's just a couple steps that you need to do it. But it is something that you can change, and I really do not like the calendar year or the school year method. The next issue is failing to provide necessary notices. I have attached, and I have a mantra about this. I have attached to the materials notices that are published by the United States Department of Labor. And I encourage every district to use these notices because you can never go wrong using the notice that the regulating agency has said it has everything that you need to do. But when somebody makes a request for FMLA leave, or you become aware that a person is entitled to FMLA leave, and although they haven't requested it, it's the first time that situation has ever come up for them, you have an obligation to give them notice of eligibility and their rights and responsibilities. We call it notice of rights and responsibilities. And you have to give them a written notice of their rights and responsibilities under the FMLA. Well, there's a form that was included in your package, WH-381, that you give to them, and you have to give it to them within 5 days of the request for FMLA leave. And there's parts for you to fill in there to give the employee the notice of the rights and responsibilities. There's a second form, a WH-382, which is a designation notice, and that's your designation of their time as FMLA leave. Sometimes those notices can be filled in together. Sometimes you might not be able to give the second notice till you have more information. But again, it's an easy-to-use form. You can even fill it out online, and it's foolproof because it's sanctioned by the Department of Labor. The other two forms I gave are WH-380-E and WH-380-F. Those are medical certification forms. So let's say an employer comes to you and requests FMLA leave, and you don't really think that the person has a serious medical condition. Or the person requests leave to care for a spouse or a sick family member, and you think that they're pulling the wool over your eyes. You can give them this certification of healthcare provider. One is for the employee's own illness, the other is for the employee's family member's illness, and they have to return it to you within 15 days. If they don't return it to you within 15 days, they're not eligible for the FMLA leave for the requested reason. So that's a medical certification form that they fill out and that they send to you. So those are the necessary notices, those first two, the notice of rights, responsibilities, and then your actual designation of their leave as FMLA leave time, are notices that you have to give to folks. And then the other two forms, the medical certifications, are tools in your toolbox if you feel that you need more information to substantiate that, in fact, this is an FMLA circumstance. So that's a bullet point, failing to provide necessary notices. The next bullet point, and I'm talking really fast here because I see my time is winding down, including FMLA absences in discipline. I cannot emphasize this enough. I can't tell you the number of school districts that we have that tell an employee at the end of the year, you've missed 30 days of school this year. Or you have, 15 absences from school. You need to improve that next year. If an hour of those absences is leave protected under the FMLA, you have now held against them the fact that they've taken FMLA leave and used it as a negative criteria. And you have interfered with their rights under the FMLA, and you've retaliated against them for using FMLA. So if you are in a situation where you regularly report to employees the amount of leave time they've taken in the year or reference it on an evaluation, you better be 100% sure that not a single hour, let alone day, of that time that you've accounted for is leave that they were entitled to take under the FMLA, whether they did take it as FMLA leave or whether they didn't because you screwed up and didn't give them notice of their rights and responsibilities under the FMLA. I've had cases that I've litigated and had to settle for substantial amounts where employers have terminated employees based on poor work attendance, where employers have included in the poor work attendance notices, whatnot, leave covered by the FMLA. So I know that a lot of school districts out there are very prone to wanting to do that and kind of push a button at the end of the year. Don't do it. Stop doing it. If you have questions about it, talk to your counsel about it. Talk to me about it, but don't do it. It is a huge trap for the unwary. Same thing with any leave that you might have granted as a leave as an accommodation for a disability. They have that statutory right to a leave under the ADA as an accommodation or to FMLA leave. You can't hold it against them. The last bullet point I have, failing to designate paid leave. The FMLA requires you to give unpaid leave, okay? But that doesn't mean that you can't require an employee to use their paid leave while they're out on FMLA leave. The law allows an employer to require an employee to use their paid leave while out on FMLA leave. Again, for you guys, that's oftentimes going to be subject to provisions of a collective bargaining agreement. The FMLA only requires an employer to give unpaid leave, but it does allow an employer to require an employee to utilize their paid leave. In other words, the employee could take 12 weeks of unpaid and then turn around and say, now I'm taking all of my sick. And the FMLA wasn't designed to give people super extended absences from work. I'm at the 1 o'clock mark. I don't know if I have any more time, if there are any questions, what my schedule is here. Matt?
Yeah, you can keep going if you'd like.
Okay. Anybody have any questions about the FMLA? I'm covering a boatload of information in a short period of time.
We don't have any other questions currently.
Okay, one of the other things is intermittent leave. In the handout that I gave you on the FMLA leave, there's a great section on intermittent leave. Like I said before, the FMLA allows people to not only take chunks of leave, you know, I can take 12 weeks consecutively. It allows me to take leave on a daily basis or an hourly basis if that's the type of leave I need for my serious medical condition. And basically, it allows people to take leave time in half an hour or hour increments. Okay, so it's and that's spelled out in the materials that I gave you. There are exceptions to that rule for teachers. Okay, and this is a little bit beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today. But just keep in mind that if you have a teacher who wants to take intermittent leave, there are restrictions on the teacher's ability to do that that is unique to the teaching profession. And I think that the federal law has decided that, you know, if I'm a maintenance worker and I take a half a day here, half a day there under the FMLA leave, the employer will survive. But that might not be the best thing for the continuity of education for kids in a classroom. So there are limitations on teachers' ability to take intermittent leave. Those are spelled out in detail in my handouts. And just have it stick in your mind that if you have that situation, have a light bulb go off saying that I need to learn more about this. I remember there's something more to it than that. Common FMLA mistakes will be the thing that we'll conclude with. Excuse me. Labor law mistakes, FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act, New York Labor Law. First of all, you guys as school districts do a great job with this. And my private employers, not so much. The first thing I always talk about people is classifying employees as exempt or non-exempt employees. Exempt means they're exempt from the overtime rules. Non-exempt means they're not exempt from the overtime rules. School districts normally do a great job with this. Just be aware that just calling somebody salaried doesn't make them exempt or non-exempt. It's pretty much a meaningless term under the, I have the FSLA, it's the FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act, not the Fair Standard Labors Act. Whether they're salaried or not, people fall in that trap all the time. They're salaried, therefore they're exempt from overtime. No. What makes one exempt or not exempt from overtime is the nature of their job duties, the nature of what they spend a majority of time doing, okay? Not whether they're salaried or not salaried. My next bullet point, timekeeping, timekeeping, timekeeping. Any of your employees who are not exempt and hence entitled to overtime, you have to keep accurate time records for those employees. They have to be forced to keep accurate time records. If you don't do that and they bring a claim that they weren't paid the overtime that they were entitled to receive, and you don't have time records, since it's the employer's obligation to make sure that you have contemporaneous time records for your employees, the Department of Labor will say, whatever the employee says were their hours, since you failed in your responsibility of forcing them to keep track of their hours. So make sure that you have a time system that all of the employees utilize that's accurate. Never let one of your supervisors say to an employee, don't log your time. Don't put your time in here. I can't pay you overtime, so don't put your time in here. Don't do that. To pay or not to pay accrued leave, vacation, for you guys, that's pretty much all dealt with in your collective bargaining agreements. Additional assignments and stipends. This is a tricky one, and nobody's going to like this answer. But let's say that I have a coach who is an exempt employee of this, a non-exempt employee of the school district. So that employee is entitled to overtime wages. And then that employee picks up extra job as a coach. And I pay that coach a stipend. I'm really running afoul of the labor law because an employee is not exempt for certain tasks and non-exempt for certain tasks. Rather, what you do is you look at all of the activities that are engaged in for the employer and then determining, based on all of those activities, is the majority of the time spent doing exempt work or non-exempt work. But any given employee only has one classification. So a non-exempt employee who is doing a coaching job, and that coaching job standing in isolation would look like an exempt position, but that employee is a non-exempt employee. And that employee's extra time spent working is not going to change the nature of their exempt or non-exempt status. So really for that employee, you have to pay them an hourly rate for the time they're spending coaching and doing all of that work, and to pay them overtime. And then you get involved in complicated rules of what rate they're entitled to for overtime. And I know that probably none of you out there do that. And I know that you're saying to yourself, oh my God, how would we ever do that? The board grants a $2,000 stipend for somebody being a coach. I would hate for any of you to be the test case for a non-exempt employee who says, you know what, I was entitled to overtime for all of those extra hours worked, because they would be right. You don't have the same problem with your teachers or other exempt employees being coaches on a stipended basis because they are exempt. And they have that exempt classification, so you can pay them a stipend, so to speak, for that time, and not run afoul of the wage and hour laws. Rights of employees under the National Labor Relations Act and the First Amendment, the ban of social media. What do you guys do when you have your employees making comments on Facebook posts or other types of things? Really, we have two issues from a First Amendment standpoint. This goes beyond the scope of today, but the question becomes is whether their comments are a matter of public concern or private concern. If it's a matter of private concern, your employees have no First Amendment rights to that speech or protections in that speech. Matters of public concern, on the other hand, are protected by the First Amendment. The other thing is if the employee is talking about terms and conditions of employment, there's very good arguments that that's concerted activity under the National Labor Relations Act. So if they're talking with other employees on a social media site about terms and conditions of employment, that could be viewed as concerted activity protected under the National Labor Relations Act, and something that if you took discipline against an employee for engaging in, you might run afoul of the NLRA. Again, areas when you want to discipline an employee for their speech, extracurricular or otherwise, good idea to get your counsel involved in that discussion. Then the last slides, which we're not going to talk about through, is the standard slide set that I give on employment discrimination and harassment and discrimination in the employment arena, but I could give a whole other lecture on that. So I'm going to leave it there and answer any questions that folks might have. You know, this is a little bit of an awkward way, and I've thrown a ton of info out there, but if anybody has any questions, let me know.
All right, we have one question here. What advance notification requirements may we require for intermittent use of FMLA?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
Yes, what advance notification requirements may we require for intermittent use of FMLA?
The rule for advance notification requirements are generally that an employee is supposed to give 30 days advance notice of an FMLA leave, and it's the least enforced provision of the FMLA ever known to mankind, because I would never really deny an FMLA leave request because they didn't give you the 30 days advance notice. They're supposed to give 30 days or as soon as practicable. The intermittent leave type of situation is oftentimes the one where advance notice is probably least likely to be given due to the nature of the leave. So when you have a situation like that where an employee isn't giving you the requisite notice, you sit down with them and you scare the Jesus out of the employee and tell the employee that they need to give you 30 days and the FMLA requires 30 days, and then you grant them the FMLA leave anyhow. You don't want to.
All right.
I wouldn't monkey around with not granting FMLA leave because somebody didn't give me the notice that's provided for in the statute, because there's a lot of outs to that notice period.
All right, thank you very much. We're a little over time, but that's all right. Thank you very much for presenting. This is a fascinating topic, and thank you all for sharing the webinar with us today. If anyone would like to rewatch the video, I'll be posting it to School Business Connect later today. Thank you very much, and everyone have a great